Hello, welcome to Solaris 10 Zones. I'm your host, Gabriel Smith, and we shall be talking about installing and configuring zones. This will be a two-part presentation. The first part will be basically a presentation with slides, and the second part will be a command line walkthrough. In other words, I'll just walk through the steps on a command line. The scope for this presentation is to give you a guide on how to get going with Solaris zones. What's out of scope for this presentation is that Solaris 11 offers several advanced features for zones. We won't be covering Solaris 11 in this presentation or its enhanced features for zones. The audience for this presentation are people such as system administrators and engineers. What's a zone? To make a long story dull, a zone is a virtual machine. For whatever reason, Oracle decided, or Solaris decided to call these virtual machines zones. Zones. But as you know, a virtual machine is an instance of an operating system that's giving virtual hardware, and it's isolated from the host as well as any other virtual machines. From Oracle's perspective, there's two types of zones. There's a global zone and a non-global zone. The global zone is basically a master zone. You wouldn't necessarily log into a global zone, but you would use the global zone to control the non-global zones. If you wanted to think of it from a logical point of view or perspective, you would basically have hardware, and on top of that hardware you would install the Solaris operating system, Solaris 10 in this presentation. And by installing Solaris 10, I believe you automatically install a global zone. It may depend on the release. Some older versions of Solaris may not have the global zone, but essentially anytime you install Solaris 10, you install a global zone. When you create additional zones, they would be called non-global zones, and they would be isolated from the other operating systems, or they would be isolated from each other. Now, there's something about this slide. Whenever I try to go to the next page, it actually takes a couple of clicks. There we go. All right. So there's several different types of non-global zones. Before we get into that, let's talk about the way non-global zones work. Whenever you create a non-global zone, what it's going to do is it's going to take a copy of the operating system and then copy it into a new directory. Now, the sparse root non-global zone will share certain parts of the host file system with the non-global zone, or the new zone that you've just created. So that's why it's called a sparse root global zone. So, for example, you could choose to share the root directory, but of course it would share it as a read-only root directory. You could share the package directory, but it would be read-only. Essentially, anytime you patch a global zone, it's going to patch the sparse root zone. The whole root zone just takes a copy of the host operating system files, and at that point it's totally independent from the global zone. So this is called a whole root zone. It's 100% independent from the global zone, whereas a sparse root zone, it's still independent as well. Well, I guess I can't say it's independent. The only dependency it would have is the directories that you've chosen to share. But again, it's not writing to those directories, it's just reading from those directories. There may be some cases where you can share the directory where you would be able to write, but in most cases it would just be a read-only copy of that directory. The branded zones basically allow you to install different versions of Solaris. So if you installed Solaris 10, then you create a non-global zone, and you decided you wanted to install Solaris 6 or maybe 8, you'd be able to do that with the branded zone. So again, just to recap, there's the sparse root zone, which basically shares your choice of the global zones system files, and then there's the whole root zone, which is 100% independent, and then there's a branded zone, which will allow you to install different versions of Solaris. Okay, so when you set up a zone, it goes through, there's different phases that you have to go through to set up a zone. The first phase is the configurations phase. To configure a zone, basically you type zone CFG -Z and then the zone name. So for conversation's sake, we're going to say the zone that we want to create is app 1. So you would type zone CFG -Z app 1, and then it will tell you that this zone doesn't exist. Would you like to create it? Once you select yes, you'll be given the option to actually configure the zone, and once you've completed that configuration, the configuration settings will be stored in etc zones. The next step is to actually install the zone. To install it, you would type zone ADM -Z app 1 in our case, and then install. After that, you want to boot the zone for the first time, but it's probably a good idea at this point just to look and see what you have. You can do that by zone ADM list. Again, that's zone ADM list -C for everything that's configured, V for verbose, meaning that you're going to get all the information possible, and then I for install. So this command is basically going to show you everything that you have running under the global zone. If you don't select these options, there's a good chance that you'll just see the global zone and nothing else. After you've listed it, you will see your app 1 zone that you've configured and installed. At this point, all you have to do is just run zone ADM -Z app 1 boot, and it's going to boot for the first time. You will then be ready to configure the zone for the first time, and when you go through this step, not necessarily configure, but you'll be able, because you've already configured the actual zone, but you will be able to configure the instance, the actual operating system, if you will. So at any rate, you would type zlogin -C for console, capital C for console, lowercase e to define your escape character, and in this case it's a bracket, and then we would type app 1. So that's zlogin -C -E, we type a bracket. You can use any escape characters you want, and then app 1. And again, you've already configured the zone itself, but this is going to allow you to make selections for the operating system. Now I need to warn you, whenever you try to configure the zone for the first time, or make your selections for the operating system for the first time around, there's a chance that you could get locked into that session. What happens is that when you go in to the console for the first time, it's going to ask you to choose your terminal type. If you select the wrong terminal type, you could get stuck because your keyboard will be unresponsive at that point. To get around this, all you have to do is just open up a new session, SSH session with the host operating system, and at that point try to log in again back in that same non-global zone. It's going to tell you that the console is being used by this processor ID. All you have to do is basically kill that processor ID and then get back in. I lost probably about 2 to 3 hours because of this. The trouble seems to be trying to figure out what terminal you need. I figured out that for VirtualBox I need to use option 12, which I think is a X terminal emulator or something of that nature. You'll get a chance to see it in the next video. Okay, that's pretty much it for installing and configuring a zone. Believe it or not, it's fairly simple. There's a lot of things that you would do in between. One of them being, or actually before, you really want to plan out your zone so that you know what you want to add into it. But the commands that I've given you is a really good jump start into installing a zone. Now, in the event that you would like to uninstall a zone, you would basically type zone ADM list minus V for verbose, C for configuration, I for install, and it'll show you everything that you have. You would then be able to see that your zone app 1 is running. At that point, you type zone ADM minus Z app 1 halt to stop it, and then at that point you can uninstall it. Zone ADM minus Z app 1 uninstall, and once it's uninstalled, at that point you can go ahead and delete it. Zone CFG minus Z app 1 delete. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this first video of installing and configuring zones. There's going to be another video that I'm going to post later on. But if you want a copy of this presentation or a copy of any other of the other presentations that I've done, go ahead and send me an email. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, send me an email. If you want me to do a video on something that I haven't done within the realm of Linux and Solaris, send me an email, busy386@gmail.com. Thank you.